Alright guys, now let's talk about grid gap. Simply, the grid gap provides the space between the two columns and rows. The grid gap specifies the size of the grid lines actually. So whatever the lines we see in between the columns and rows, this is the line. Let's inspect it. That's the arbitrary line actually, and here we are seeing these black lines just because we have defined the border. Save this. Let's have a look. No border. Then go to the layout. Here we'll say so line names and this div content, yeah, and make it black so that we can have clarity. Okay, so this is the arbitrary line that we can see. So the grid gap property will set the width of these arbitrary lines, which will work as a gap between the columns and rows. Yeah, so let's define the grid gap. So here let's say grid gap maybe 32 pixel. Save this. Let's have a look. Okay, make it black again. Yeah, you can see this is the grid line, and to the grid line we have also do, yeah, the first line having the, we don't need to specify the width of the first line, that's why there is no space here. Yeah, then the gap between the columns, so this is the grid line width. So you can think of as it as a grid line width, or you can also think it of as a gap between the columns and rows. That's what the grid gap property does. The grid gap property will provide the space between the rows and columns. You can provide any values. You may say 2 rem, to be rephrase 2 rem, 4 rem. So whatever the space you want or whatever the width of the line you want, you can specify that. This is the shorthand property actually, grid gap. It provides the a gap for the columns also as well as rows also. If you want to provide individually, you can also say grid column gap actually. Column gap maybe 32 pixel. Save this, give it a refresh. That's the column gap. Now if you want to provide the row gap, you can also say row gap. Give it a refresh. Okay, you can see the row gap. Now that's the longhand properties, grid column gap or grid row gap. And that's the old ways to define those gap. These are the properties, the grid column gap and grid row gap or grid gap was the old conventional way. So this has been updated to, you can directly say now these days column gap. You can say 3 rem. 3 rem. Yeah, column gap 3 rem. Give it a refresh. You can see now this has been defined. Now this is working as a column gap, or instead of we can say grid column gap, you can directly say column gap. Similarly, you can also say row gap maybe 4 rem. Yeah, save this, give it a refresh. That's a row gap. And if you want to say just for all of these column gap and row gap, that's a shorthand property. So instead of saying grid gap, we can say just gap maybe 4 rem. Save this, give it a refresh. Perfect. That's the gap actually. I hope you got the idea what is the use of grid gap or just gap, or grid column gap, grid row gap, or just column gap or row gap. So these properties are used to define the width of the line, or you can say it is used to define the space between the columns and rows.